Oh, thank you, Joy. One person has confirmed they can see my slide. I hope the rest
Yes, we
can't
can
see
see
my
your
slides.
slide, Dr. Ruth. We can see your slide.
All right.
And sorry,
Today
one
we're
more
going.
thing, Dr. Ruth. I'll be here if you need any assistance. You can just let me know.
All right. Okay, so this session will take the whole day. Yeah, no, 1 hour, not the whole day. I'm sorry that all of you have been here and there was this confusion on when we can hold this session. So these were supposed to be 2 sessions, but we've managed to put them together as one session. So we are going to cover disease entry points and look at the core biosecurity practices. So this is going to be a very interactive session and we'll have opportunities to interact among us. So here are the learning outcomes. So the first one is to spot the main ways disease get into smallholder poultry systems. And then within the course, we're going to prioritize and rank one high impact risk to tackle first. And this is based on what you already know about poultry farms and borrowing from the earlier on session where that is the first session where you discussed a little bit about poultry value chains. And then match risks to 3 doable practices. So when you think about poultry problems or biosecurity problems or antimicrobial use problems, how are we going to match them to 3 doable practices? Because there is a reliance of suggesting practices that are not easier for farmers to apply. And then we will craft a simple farmer-friendly pitch for change, because as most of you are aware, after the end of this training, the 12 sessions, you're going to have a chance to some of you are going to have a chance to practice what we've trained and do it in farm field environments. So this is how we will work. We'll start with a quick poll, 2 short breakouts, and 1 consolidated assignment. So before we go to the poll, I want to just confirm, and this is something you can just quickly type in your chat box. Were you given an assignment last week, and what did you encounter when you were out there? You can just type that on the chat box.
Hello, Dr. Ruth. The first session held yesterday, so they've not had the opportunity to submit the assignment yet, but they've been given the assignment
So the first session was held yesterday.
yesterday. Yes, so they've not been able to carry
Right.
out, but you can adapt. I think you can work with that too.
All right. Okay, if that is the case, then we're just going to go direct to this short quiz that I've developed. I don't know if all of you can just scan the QR code if you have your phones, or if you don't have your phones, go into this platform and then we'll start. Don't use this. Of course, you can't use this. Just go to this platform. The information is on the right side of the slide. So all of you should just confirm that you have been able to do that. Just confirm by just typing on the chat box that you've been able to join. I'm going to reshare again. I just stopped sharing so that I can find the screen that has that information, because I'm worried that it's possible you may not be able to see it beyond. So I'm sure right now you can see most of it.
Excuse me, doctor.
I've just gone to a better dashboard so that all of you can see. If you can join via that, you can, or you can join, you can just go to the internet and type joinmyquiz.com and then enter the joining code. There's only 4 participants who've joined, so join as many. We do have, how many attendees for this call today? We have 62 attendees, so we will start when we have approximately 50 attendees into, yeah. So we only have 11 who've joined, 13. We have 19. I'm just going to give us time, at least we get to 50. We may not have everyone join because people are still joining into this meeting, and most of us have waited here for quite some time. So just going to start when we have approximately 50 attendees. So we only have 29 who've joined into the quiz. So we are at 37 and we have 67 attendees. We're just halfway there. So I'm going to just give it another 1 minute, so to speak, so that some of you can join, and then we are going to start. We may not wait up to 50, it seems. So just waiting for the last one, the 40th. We have 40. I'm going to start now. So for the rest, we'll redo the quiz again at the end of the session, and I hope you will have a chance to join. So for those who've not managed to join. So I'm going to start, and then we're going to proceed from there. So it is a multiple choice question. You need to only choose one response, and you will have approximately 45 seconds to choose a response. And the quicker you choose, probably the higher points you have. And yeah, and if you choose a wrong answer, of course, you don't get any points. So we're just going to start right now with the first question. And it's a timed quiz, so everything will keep on playing until the end of the last quiz, and we'll know what we've done past the end of the quiz. So 46, so it seems like we may get our 50 number after all. Okay, 46 it seems. So a farmer mixes new chicks with older birds. Which is the most important risk? It's a timed session, so after a few minutes, So a number of you answered, and we're going to figure out which is the right answer. So we're going to just continue to the next question. We'll discuss the answers later. So just go to the next question. So only 27 got the correct answer. And the answer is pathogens can quickly spread from older to younger chicks. So the next one. So we've done this assessment, and we will discuss in the course of the session what were the right answers. So I just decided to stop at that, just not to kind of discuss this and see how everything goes. But as far as it's concerned right now, we can see who's done well in this test and who's not done well in this simple exercise. So we're just going to go back to the presentation and continue discussing from there. I'm going to stop again to share my screen, and we'll find out what happened in the course of doing this assessment, who got what right, and why did we get some of the questions wrong. So So we've just done a short quiz which encompasses what we're going to study today, which includes how we are going to figure out issues to do with biosecurity and how we develop simple solutions for farmers we interact with. So I'm going to go to the and speak about human movement, which is one of the highest pathway that we overlook. All of us know, or most of us know, that farmers and workers moving between flocks without hygiene measures is a risk factor. So a farmer can move from one poultry house to the next poultry house without changing their footwork, among other things, their clothes, washing their hands, and they may spread infections between flocks. We also know that, especially in our context, that is sub-Saharan Africa, we tend to allow anyone to enter into our poultry houses. And this is with regards to trying to show our fellow colleagues, farmers, friends, of the investments we've made, and sometimes it comes out of ignorance, not knowing the risk. The other one is traders. We do allow traders, mostly the ones who've been interacted with so many farms and maybe went to bad markets, to actually enter into our farms, and they are very high risk factor for diseases. So the other risk factor is most farms in sub-Saharan Africa, and I've shown an image here on the right, they do not have dedicated booths, hand washing, or foot bath at entry, which is a very, very common phenomenon. And there is evidence that shows that if we don't put in these factors, the risk of disease is high, and there is publications that you can read. I've provided links down here that you can check, that have shown that when poultry workers move between farms, they can transmit or transfer Salmonella and Campylobacter between farms, and live bird markets amplify avian influenza. I don't know, most of you may have heard of avian influenza, which is a highly zoonotic virus that the world is worried about right now. And FAO provides simple interventions that have been known to reduce pathogen transfer. And this medium, or this information, is available on the FAO Biosecurity Practices in Poultry Production, which is a simple reading material that most of you can read and see how we can actually reduce pathogen transfer amongst farms. So the whole essence of this slide is to emphasize that the weakest link in farm biosecurity is human movement, which is a big indicator or risk factor that we need to worry about as we deal with this problem of biosecurity. And as we know, if all these diseases are introduced, there is a likelihood that animals get sick and farmers end up using antibiotics. So other risk factors are animal vectors. And these include wild birds, which I've just mentioned earlier on. They carry avian influenza and Newcastle disease, which are very common poultry diseases. I mean, Newcastle, so to speak. Rodents, most of you know of rodents, rats, among other. They carry Salmonella, Leptospira, E. coli, which are linked to poultry farm outbreaks. And we've also known about flies. Most people don't even think about flies. If you keep your poultry house unhygienic and there is a lot of flies, they can transmit or transfer pathogens between flocks. Last but not least is ducks and geese, and other animals within the poultry or within the farm household that exist in mixed production system. We do know well that most farmers operate in mixed production systems, and there are various reasons as to why they do so. And these complicate disease control measures, especially in the context where there is no biosecurity measures. So when all these animal vectors as a risk exist within your environment, they allow pathogens to transfer across species, contaminate feed and water, even the housing, and trigger outbreaks that drive higher antibiotic use. It's very self-explanatory. I try to make these slides very, very simplistic so that if you intend to go through them, you don't need to more information about that you need to read from this reading material. So the other risk factor is mixing age groups. From the quiz we did, we saw that farmers tend to mix age groups. So young chicks have weak immune systems. This is something we know, and are highly susceptible to pathogens. And older birds, even though they may look healthy, they may be carriers of disease. Even if you treated them and they recovered, they may be carriers of disease. So there is evidence, and we are doing evidence-based interventions in the field. Chick house with older birds show significant higher mortalities and antibiotic treatments, and this even influences growth rates, and these chicks don't meet market weight quite early on time, and this is a problem. Infectious basal disease virus can survive in poultry houses for months. So older birds reinfect younger batches. So if you had older birds and you did not clean the house properly, some pathogens might persist in the environment. And when you introduce younger birds, these birds can be infected. And this is separation between birds, which is something that we'll cover later on. And it's common that, especially in Kenya, that mixing ages is common in smallholder production systems, and it's linked to a Newcastle outbreak. Very, very straightforward. More sick birds, more antibiotics, stronger AMR pressure. In the course of the session, you will learn more about AMR and what AMR and why we care about it. But antimicrobial resistance, some of you have an idea of, is when bacteria change and they cannot be killed by antibiotics that used to kill them previously. So this is a problem that we are concerned, and that is why we are hosting these sessions. So now we're going to go into breakout session. I hope you are the Bioshield team is within call. And even before we go into the breakout session, I'm going to just invite a few questions to see if people have any questions that they want to ask. I don't know, does someone have any question?
Yes, I have a question.
Are there any question? Okay. Nixon, please go ahead. If you have a question, please signify with your hand raised.
Okay.
Nixon,
Okay, thank you, Doctor, for the presentation. Then my question would be, you have talked about the challenges, maybe with the context of Kenya in application of biosecurity on poultry farms, and I think maybe it's a general consensus within East Africa on how biosecurity is carried out. My question is, according to maybe the farmers we have and their capacity, what should be the bare minimum of the biosecurity measures that a farm should have, so that if we are to advise, we give advice which is contextual to them and they can easily apply to them? Thank you.
Thank you for asking that question. I'm not going to answer it now because the next couple of slides are going to cover that. Yeah, the next couple of slides are going to cover that. So if it's not covered before the end of the session, then I will answer it. So it's right. So so the Bioshield team can organize people into breakout sessions, and then you can discuss one of a case study. I believe you interacted with this case study last week,
Yes.
but you're going to interact with it in a different kind of context now. So
Yes, thank you. We are currently on it. We are trying to organize the participants into their
okay.
breakout room. So just as we did yesterday, please you join the breakout rooms that correspond to your groupings that have been shared to you on the WhatsApp page previously. So if you're a group one member, kindly join breakout session one, and then as instructed yesterday, it's the same protocol. You are to have a repertoire or a team lead who will be representing the team to report whatever you have discussed, the summary of what you discussed to the general participants here on the general room. And lastly, the points of discussion are different from yesterday's points of discussion as stated here, and that will also be shared to you on the chat box. So yeah, I don't know if you can get a copy of that in the chat box. Okay, so you can start joining the breakout session. Okay, all Bioshield team members should please coordinate their group, their breakout session, so as to ensure we all achieve the goals of the breakout session. Thank you.
Hello. Hello. Good evening, everyone. Please, I'm not hearing anyone. Hello.
Hey, everyone went to the chat rooms, so I think you should get yourself one according to your group. Yeah.
Sorry, please, good afternoon. What group are you talking about?
Groups
Hello,
were
good evening,
given
ma'am.
to everyone. Hello?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so there are 6 chat rooms for different groups, depending on the group that you're in. So you choose it. Are you using your phone or laptop?
Phone. I can't find any link to any chat room or something.
At the top corner of your phone, top left, you see something like chat rooms, I think. Boardrooms, something.
No food facts at the poultry entrance. Then, because using of antibiotics.
I can't find the chat room, or what did you call it? Okay, the breakout room.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for coming back to the. We are now in the general room. Ms. Bakari, we are now in the general room. So, for all team leads, I hope we have all gotten what we discussed.
Abdul Basit.
Yes, doctor. Please go ahead.
I'm going to kindly request that you probably redo the breakout session. There's some people who are struggling to join and they didn't have instructions on how to join the breakout session. So we can just redo the breakout session again. And
Okay.
the group they only went past one word. Nobody said anything. So
okay.
We're just going to redo it for the last time, and people will be quite quick to engage with the case study.
Okay, so I believe everyone on the call should have gotten all the instructions. But in case, I would share the instructions and the questions. I think Blessing can help us with that. Or Dr. Ruth, can we get the questions on chat box so that
The
I think
questions are
there's
in
more.
chat box, and I'm going to send them again. So those are the
Okay.
questions. So from East Africa session, and
Okay.
write 3 to 4 risks you've observed. So at least if 17 of you have joined the call, you should know how many risks you've observed, like it's a small case study. And then from the risks you've observed, rank both set from the most to the least serious, like what is the most serious, what is the least serious, and then choose one priority, serious risk, and realistic way to fix it. And then write 1 sentence explanation you'd use with your farmer. If you're to talk to a farmer and you've interacted with them, how are you going to solve these problems? So that is the assignment that you have. So everything is on the chat box, the case study, and everything you need to know. So to join the breakout rooms, if you look at your dashboard below here where there is the video, audio, wherever, when they open the chat box, there will be in the breakout rooms, there will be a box written breakout. You'll just see it clearly at the base. Just click on that and join your respective breakout room.
Okay, thank you so much, Doctor. Please, can we get to do the breakout session once more? Thank you. So you can all join the breakout session again. Yes, it's available. You can all go back to join your breakout session.
Joshua, join any breakout room at this point, because if you don't know your respective one, just join the one that you are able to join.
Okay. If you are not
There's some
sure
people
of
don't know which
your
their
group,
breakout. Yeah.
yeah, you can just join any of the breakout session. But after the today's call, we'll address that. You can, and how do you join the breakout session? You click on the icon saying more with three dots within a cycle. When you click it, you see join breakout room as a second option. When you click that join breakout room, you see the various breakout rooms available. Bioshield Squad 1 to 6. So you join the one you want to join and then participate actively in the breakout room. Thank you. So I don't expect anyone to be here again with that description instruction. Yeah, welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the welcome back from the breakout session. I believe we've all had enough time to interact and share ideas, discuss. Dr. Ruth, should we go on to start calling the group representatives to actually to share what they discussed?
Yes, the rapporteurs should go ahead and start
Okay.
describing what they saw. And quickly, you have like essentially 1 minute to describe. We'll start with breakout 1. What did you discuss?
Okay.
And instead of listing everything, just tell me what you thought was the most serious and realistic to fix, and what are you going to tell that farmer if you meet them? That is Mr. Africa. That is where I want you to concentrate on.
Group 1, you have the floor, please. Group 1's representative, please go ahead. You have just a minute.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Yes, good afternoon, Veronica.
I think the most problematic thing we discovered, the biosecurity risk we discovered, is his mode of poultry farming. That is the way he puts his animals together. So we discussed that the best way that he can start off due to economic problems is because of he will start with semi-extensive poultry system, whereby he can easily just make separate cubicles or separate poultry for the animals, and then he'll be able to separate the hatchery, the older ones, and the growers, so that in this way he also avoid risking the animals getting sick together and giving antibiotics carelessly and infecting the animals that are not sick, and also separating them from having outside contact from people and other animals. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. So yours is separating the sick from separating the sick from the non-sick, or separating what is it called? The young ones from the old ones.
I think I said like separating the poultry animals from other animals, then separating like making separate cocoons or cubicles for each and every one of them.
All right.
Like I put it together.
Okay, you are supposed to choose one priority risk. You've coupled several priority risks, and we'll discuss later why that is a problem. So the next one, the next group 2.
Group 2, please, you can have the floor.
And even as you're responding, just know there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. Is how we process information. So just proceed and explain yourself. So
Group
choose
2.
one priority risk and how you are going to explain to the farmer to correct it.
Do we have a group 2 representative on the call, or a member from the group 2, from the group 2 breakout session? Okay, I think we should move on to group 3.
Group 3.
Group 3, please, you have the floor.
Oh, all right, thank you. So
Group 2 or group 3?
Group 3.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, the priority risk is high visitors traffic without biosecurity control. So one sentence to explain to farmer without judging them, like to keep your birds healthy and safe, I will advise you provide an hygiene station so that whenever visitors are coming in, they can clean and change their shoes or wash their hands before entering the poultry area, because even healthy looking animals can carry germs that make them sick, and most diseases that affect your birds, they are actually from outside. So providing an hygiene station will make them reduce the risk as which your animals fall sick.
Thank you, Favor. Yes, one priority risk yours was high traffic, and you gave the reason as to why how they're going to achieve this. So Osho has raised their hand. I believe they're from group 2.
Yes, he is. Please go ahead, Osho. Osho, you have the floor, please. Osho. Okay, group 4. Do you have a group, the group 4 rep?
And group 5 and 6 should be prepared to be ready to respond immediately. The other one has finished.
Group 4, Muhammad Sanusi. Group 4, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. The highest risk we have gotten, we were able to identify is the influx of large amount of people like people coming into the farm without appropriate measures like hand washing and food baths. So the advice I would give the farmer is for him to make sure those measures are being considered, putting the food baths and hand washing section before entering to the farm, because those are the first things to be. The visitor coming to the farm will have to pass through that section before they come into the farm to avoid any pathogens or germs taken into the farm.
Thank you, Mohammed. The next one, that is group 5, quickly.
Thank you very much. So for group 5, the risk that we thought was the highest was the fact that there are a lot of people that come to Mr. Africa's farm, relatives, neighbors passing through, and there's no foot bath or a hand washing station. So from the earlier presentation in my group, we said that humans are one of the greatest risks to disease transmission. So what we'll tell Mr. Africa is that he needs to put a hand washing basin for these farmers that are coming to buy birds or to visit. And he should also, maybe, if he's not able to build a proper foot bath, he can maybe improvise and put like a bucket as a food basin so that he can prevent diseases from being spread. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Group 6.
Our priority risk was we thought of mixing the old birds and the new birds, as this will lead to maybe the spread of infections within the poultry farm. So for us, we will tell Mr. Africa to try and separate the new birds from the old birds, as we'll be explaining to him about the risk that it comes with due to mixing. Thank you.
Thank you. So the purpose of this exercise, Osho was as messaged in the group that he was speaking and or they were speaking and we couldn't hear them. So I've requested them to type their response into the group. So the purpose of this exercise was to for us to actually understand that as animal health advisors or field extension officers, we are confronted with very, very complex problems. You meet a farmer and they have so many problems. There is a likelihood that we may want to solve all these problems at once, which is not very realistic. And there is farmers' resistance. The studies that have been done, and this is one of the examples of the study which was done, that shows that farmers struggle with so many, when they're given so many advices, some changes are not really adopted because they just fall through the cracks. You've told them so many things, it becomes a very complex problem to solve, and then you have to actually figure out how to prioritize. So in the end of this exercise, as you think through it, we need to figure out how to prioritize. All the answers you provided are not wrong. All of them, you could say they are right. But the highest risk here, in the sense, is the sick birds. So if a farmer brought in 300 new chicks and placed in a brooder or in a house that had other chicks, that is one of the biggest risks that we need to figure out how to solve. So, and then you can now plan for the second risk, which could be now add a foot bath, another risk, do all these things. So you can figure out based on the circumstances you have, based on the farmer you've interacted with, which is possible for them to do immediately. Biosecurity is like, it's very complex as a subject for a farmer to implement. So as you're interacting with farmers, you need to figure out how to package this information into bite-sized pieces so that farmers can actually internalize this information and see how you can solve this information with, okay, this week we are going to deal with this specific one. Next week we are going to deal with the next specific one, or we can even combine two at the same time. But you can't tell the farmer to actually change all these things before the next week, as an example. So just to emphasize, the main things when we are thinking about biosecurity, I like to break them into 3 core rules or 3 core practices. So the things you're supposed to emphasize with farmers when you're talking to farmers, and this is easier to actually when you package it this way. So you have to emphasize to farmers that they need to separate all type of birds, like if they're healthy versus sick, different ages, and all these things. And you can provide simple, actionable procedures on how they do this. One of the examples that I've seen people do is, okay, I'm brooding chicks and there's not so many, and this is especially for those who keep indigenous chicken, they brood them in a box. This box is a separate environment from all the other birds, and this may secure the health of these birds. So you look and contextualize what the farmer is doing and see how you can adapt this information. And this is in line with the question that was asked earlier on. The second thing is clean the house, have a hand sanitation area between, disinfect your feet, disinfect your hands, and this is something that needs to be tackled. The first 2, separate and clean, are very inseparable. They need to be acted on very, very quickly. And last but not least is feed and water. Ensure the animals are interacting with clean feed containers, food that is placed in areas where it's not easily contaminated, and water that is essentially potable water that is accessible and can be drunk by people, essentially, so to speak. So you need to figure out, in the context that you're operating, which one is easy to action at the time, because you will be encouraged, and some of you are going to be given tasks to go to the field and implement some of these practices. You need to figure out which one, depending on the context that you're dealing. As an example, Mr. Africa, there are so many problems that he has. He was successful in the first round. In the first round, he had birds, not so many died. He has already sold over 3/4 of those birds. So it tells you that his environment and how he's interacting with his poultry house is essentially cleaner. He has so many risks. So which one are you going to prioritize? Tell him, okay, you have all these problems, let's do this one, at least today, and then figure out how we do the next one. So to continue, and this is in line to seeing how we encourage farmers to actually apply better practices. So there's several practices that you need to encourage farmers to do. And I've just given why it matters and how you feel like you need to package this information. I'm not going to over insist and probably read this word for word because it's very, very self-explanatory. As an example, bird management practice is mixing chicks with older birds, and this is separate flocks by age and health. And you contextualize in the basis of how a farmer, as you can tell a farmer who, as you can see, doesn't really have a proper house, as an example, to actually build a new 2 houses for different groups of birds. It's impossible and impractical for you to actually propose that. So you need to propose changes that are easy for each farmer to implement. So I'm not going to read each one of them, and they're very, very self-explanatory. But the key message here, farmers don't need to be very, very perfect, because we do have this notion as practitioners when we think about biosecurity and what we've been taught in schools. How are you going to ensure that a farmer implements these high standards, and we overburden farmers with the need to be perfect? We all need them to just do small low-cost changes done consistently that have the biggest impact. So as an example, recommending that they ensure that they have a footbath. It's low cost, you're asking them to use a basin. You can ask them to use, instead of buying expensive disinfectant, to use just store-bought bleach as an example. It's a disinfectant. It's not the perfect disinfectant, but it's a small low-cost change that can be done consistently, not something that you ask them to do today, and when you come next, they're not doing it, and then they blame you for providing them with bad advice. So you need to provide them this advice in the context that this is one of the many steps that you need to do to ensure that even as you're improving your farming practices, you are going towards a stepwise process in achieving the goals that you need to achieve. So why does consistency matter? Because as you can see from my slide, what I'm emphasizing is consistency, like how can farmer remain consistent? Doing a few simple practices every day protect flocks more than doing many things once in a while. I'll give an example. We are all encouraged to eat fruits and vegetables. So you can choose to eat fruit and vegetables on Monday only, or you can probably eat fruits and vegetables every day, small portions and small portion and small portion. Maybe you don't like vegetables as an example. So if you break it into small everyday practices, it's easier to persist and do them over a long time. So even partial adoption of biosecurity reduces disease outbreak and antibiotic use. So sometimes we have the notion of you have to adopt every practice to actually reduce disease outbreak and antibiotic use. And we've just discussed one example where if you have a foot bath or you're separating the sick and the healthy parts, it has an impact, because if you're separated the sick may not reinfect the non-sick ones, and then you have success in your poultry production system. So farmers succeed when prevention becomes a habit, not a one-off action. And this essentially means, like I gave the example, if you are exercising and you choose to exercise once a month versus exercising every day, doing few steps. It is easier to make that a habit than saying I will exercise on the 10th day of every month. It's very, very difficult to actually catch up. So there is evidence that has been done that consistent application is very, very important, as opposed to these major investment that farmers have to do. And then we've seen the studies that have shown that 2 to 3 biosecurity measures have significantly lowered Newcastle outbreak than farms doing none. So as you can see, instead of leaving a farmer in that state where they can't do anything, so you have to think in the context that you have, because you will, in the course of these sessions, you will learn what are the minimum biosecurity. And these minimum biosecurity are listed in one of these documents, the FAO 2020 Good Practices document. You can see how you can adopt these measures and encourage farmers to adopt these measures. So we are going to go into the last session. And this is a breakout session, and we're not going to kind of belabor this breakout session. So we are going to be very, very quick. And please, you already have gotten the gist of the breakout sessions. We have to repeat the first breakout session so that we can quickly wrap up and call it a night for those who are in the East African and Southern African time zones. So the Bioshield team, you need to send people to the last breakout session.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Ruth, for that wonderful session. So we're going on to the second breakout exercise, and this is tagged the patterns on pitch. And the instruction are, as you can see on the screen, and will be shared to your chat box too. So, okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ruth, for that. Okay, so kindly join your respective breakout session, and let's get to work on time. Time is number on our side. Thank you so much, everyone. So you have to choose one practice from the rule of 3, and the rule of 3 are, I'm checking them down. We all got that. That is the cleaning, separating, and so when we pick one of these 3, we should discuss why this practice is the most doable in your context, according to you, and define what the first step the farmer could take immediately or tomorrow. So we're expecting you in the next 5 minutes, to do this in the next 5 minutes.
How do we join the breakout room? How do you join the breakout room? The breakout room, I've not joined. Hello? Join breakout room.
I kindly look at your screen. You have been assigned a room 1 to 6, either of the numbers. Jeffrey, kindly join your group. Amarachi. Jeffrey, Clinton.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. We've looked at and still we were working with Mr. Africa case, and you will be working a lot with the Mr. Africa case. So which just starting with the first group quickly. Which practice did you choose? What is the first step that they're going to implement, and how are you going to speak to this farmer in simple, friendly words on how they should change this practice?
So group
we're
one, go
starting with
first.
group
You have
one.
20 seconds. You have 20
Okay,
seconds.
thank
Group
you.
one. I'm timing you already. Thank you. Please go straight to the point.
The practice clean entry, and the most doable thing is setting up a footbath, maybe a basin for the start with a disinfectant. Then how to talk to them, as we tell them the importance of how a footbath is necessary, all the fact that many people pass by the farm and they can be carrying pathogens, and then it is a very easy thing to do and it is easy and also affordable for them to do. Thank you.
The second one, we need to
Group
just
two.
quickly go through and then I'll speak.
All right, for group two, we choose separate. And the first step is provide a small pen or cage to move any sick-looking birds away from healthy flocks immediately. Why is it doable? Separating sick birds is simple and cheap because it does not require buying expensive equipment. Farmer can easily use a spare cage, basket, or even a corner in isolating the sick birds. Draft pitch. Farmer, if you see a sick chicken, don't leave it with the others. Move it to a small pen. This simple step will stop disease from spreading, protect your birds, and save you money.
The third one, I'm just trying to move us along. So
By group, I decided to go with separates. This is because when you separate new birds from the older ones, it reduces and control the spread of diseases. The new birds, for instance, giving birth to a new baby, you cannot just carry the baby into the crowd because the immune is too low and it is susceptible to diseases. So using that scenario, you separate your birds. And my advice to the farmer is you don't need to break a bank before you separate these birds. You can just get a carton or a box and put these chicken, the new ones or the sick ones, and separate them from the older ones. So you don't need to break a bank or to go ahead to build a house or another poultry farm. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, group four. Thank you so much, Rita. Group four.
Okay.
Group four,
For
please
group
proceed.
four. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, for group four, we went with providing safe feed and water, owing to the fact that when people or babies are fed well, their immune system are stronger, and also when you're able to wash their hands like humans, we have to wash our hands every day before we eat. So it's a doable practice because he doesn't have to go out of his way. Since he's already giving them feed and water, he should make sure they are safe, and also the feed is covered so there are no pathogens and all of that. And our pitch is to encourage the farmer, thank him for what he has been doing, and also expose him to the fact that this feed and water he's providing, if they are not safe, they can expose his birds to sickness and give him a lower yield. But if they are safe for them, their immune system will be intact, so there will be no disease that will need to be treated at the end of the day. And it's something he should continue to be consistent in, washing the cans every day, and also providing the feed. Covering the feed should be something that does not cost him anything at all.
Okay, thank you so much, Emanuela. Group five, please go ahead.
Thank you. So for my group, we chose separation as well. So we said one thing that we can tell Mr. Africa that he could do the next day is to outsource some material like carton boxes to separate the younger chicks that he's brought in from the older ones, as he's waiting to sell those older ones. So because separation would tell him that separation is a form of preventive strategy. So the older ones could have bring diseases to the younger chicks. So he will not even be spending money. Maybe he can even go to a local shop. There can be a local shop nearby. He asks for some boxes that he can use to separate these older birds from the new ones. So he won't have to spend money. So this is economically feasible for him to do the next day.
Thank you. I think you are the last one, or are we expecting a last one?
Last group 6.
We are the group 5.
Group 6. In group 6, we decided to go with separate because it does not require a high investment in capital, especially for a small farmer. And we said the step that he can do the next day is basically separate the sick by use of carton boxes, which he can source from local shops and stuff, and also separate the young from the old ones using like a cardboard or something like that. And the way we would tell him in about 20 seconds is that explain to him about disease spread, especially in poultry, and also explain to him some of the signs that he can use to detect the sick birds so that he can separate them as soon as he notices the sick birds from the flock, so that the spread of disease can be curbed early. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. As you can see, 90% of the time you need to help a farmer make decisions quickly, and they need to make these decisions within some of the decisions that they need to make is decisions that need to, especially in the context of the diseases you're dealing with, that need to happen quite immediately, and they have the best benefits. From this exercise and looking at Mr. Africa's case, most of you suggested around separation of the sick and improving clean entry, that is a clean house, and ensuring that if people are entering into the house are entering in a clean state. So most of the practices that I do suggest and encourage people to adopt are practices associated with these two, because improved nutrition, as an example, it works, yes, but the chances are the farmer, every average smallholder farmer has, let's say, $1,000, or let's say $100. Let me use $100. These $100, they need to buy feed for chicken, feed for cows, feed for whatever, pay school fees, do all these things. So within their priorities rank, if you are saying, oh, do something about feed, some of the, unless they already have the feed with them, it is a cost issue. So this cost issue, then you may be putting yourself at a disadvantage because you're encouraging farmers to adopt practices that are maybe, yes, high impact, but in the short run is something that the farmer cannot do. There are a few terms that were said earlier on when people were presenting. One of them, you do not need to break the bank, which is what farmers want to hear. They don't want to hear that anything you are suggesting that they need to spend more money. You will keep your birds alive. It's a preventative strategy, so that in the event there is, so that you reduce any likelihood of a disease. So those are the terms we need to see within our pitches when we are talking to farmers. We need to actually package the information in such a way that it's something that they can implement tomorrow. When I say something that you need to implement tomorrow, it's today. I've told you to do something. It's something that you can actually do tomorrow, not you need other factors around you to solve. So when you're thinking, when you're interacting with farmers, because you really have a very short window to actually convince this farmer to do the right thing, you don't want to bundle them with things they can't do tomorrow. So you need them to do actually think of things that they will do literally tomorrow. Like right now, if I tell you tomorrow I need you to clean your house, it's something that is very possible that I will wake up and clean my house. But if you tell me tomorrow I need you to actually build a section of your house, I may build it. It's very, very important, but it's very likely that tomorrow I may have problems. I might have other responsibilities that I wanted to do, and it's not possible for me to actually do it tomorrow. So this was the thought process. When you meet farmers, you need to, first of all, prioritize what is the problem that I'm dealing with. And then the second thing is within this problem, break it into small bite-sized pieces, which is the first thing that a farmer needs to act on, and then proceed from there. So I'm going to go to the last slide, and I'm sure you're all happy that I now am mentioning the last slide, which is the next assignment that you need to do. I'm sorry, I wasn't aware that you didn't have time to do the other assignment. So right now we've been mapping risks, and we've been trying to match them to a practice and making a pitch. This is what we've done essentially today. We've mapped all the potential risks that can occur in a poultry house or a
Dorothy,
poultry
can't see your
farm.
screen. Sorry,
You can't see my screen, so sorry. And show. Let me share again. Share. So all of you can see my slide now, I believe so.
Can.
So today what we've done, we've mapped risks. We've tried to match them to a specific practice, because a risk can have so many practices that you need to do, but you really want the farmer to actually change small practices as opposed to telling them, okay, do a total overhaul of your production system, and then how to make a pitch. This is what we are thinking. Like when you're talking to a farmer, you need to speak to them quickly and help them make a decision. So this assignment is due in 48 hours, and you will do it all the information about how you submit the assignment will be shared by the Bioshield team. So the assignment is visit a poultry setup, your own neighborhood or community. Take a photo of the setup. I'm sure you've done this before. Identify one main risk you've observed. Is it a disease entry point issue, as an example? Choose one practices from the rule of 3, separate, clean, and safe. Categorize them into this. Is it a separation issue? Is it a clean entry issue? Or is it a safe feed and water? Remember, I initially said, like, you may be suggesting issues around feed and water, and then they may not be a priority, but in the context that you're operating, I'm going to presume that the farm that you've met, all these things apply. Like it could be they've dealt with separation, they have dealt with clean entry, they have dealt with safe feed and water. I mean, they have dealt with some of these things. I've organized them in essentially kind of order of priority. The order of priority is separations, ensuring there's a separation between sick, healthy, and wherever, and clean entry, and then safe feed and water. I've just put it in the last. Describe the first step the farmer could take within 48 hours. Today we said do it in tomorrow, so this is within 48 hours, and explain it in a lot of words. Describe the steps, and then when you've described all these steps, now you can describe these steps, let's say with half a page of whatever, and now write a pitch using simple words, how you're going to convince this farmer in 20 seconds. You have 20 seconds to 1 minute to convince this farmer. Write what you need to say, the touch points, the key things that you need to speak to this farmer. So I hope you've all understood what we are trying to do here. So this information is going to be shared, and we are going to go back to a quiz that we did earlier on. The information was shared on the chat box, but I'm sure the team is going to still share the same information. So I'm going to do the same, and we are going to redo the test. Now that you've done we've discussed some of the issues that we are discussing today. Sorry, I'm being bothered by dogs that are here. So we are going to repeat. The first instance was essentially to allow us to just essentially is this thing. Where did my quiz go? Let's see, library. Yes, here it is. So here is it, join my quiz again, and I'm providing people opportunity to join and just redo it again. So I'm going to share this on chat. I hope all of you can see my screen.
Yes, we
people have
can.
started joining.
Yes,
So,
we can see it.
all right.
See it.
So please join, and I believe all of you are going to be competing for position 1 because you've already kind of captured content around you that essentially makes sense. And the person who wins this, the Bioshield team will see you. In the Kenyan context, we say outside the tent. Essentially, they will see you privately. So the class had 100 people. So I'm going to hope that 100 people are going to be able to join. The Bioshield team is going to paste this in the group chat. Maybe let me try and do the same and paste it in the group chat. Yeah. So for those who have on their computer, they can just essentially click on the link and just immediately join. Perfect. Thank you, Abdul Basit. So the easiest way to join is go to the chat. There is a link, click, enter the code, and you're already in the chat, or use the QR code. Also, you can join by clicking the link that I've just shared. The last link I shared will take you right to the page. We have 53 participants who've joined, and this is the last thing we are doing today. So we have 95 people in the group chat, so I'm going to aim for 70% of the attendees. So, and that is approximately 70 people. We had 61. There is a link in the chat. You just need to click on the link and you are set. And so, you know, the quicker you respond to their question, the higher points you have. For those who've played Kahoot.
How will I join?
Yes.
Because the thing is, I can't join this thing. No, the screen is very small. Is it to join from where?
So
To
go
start?
to the chats and click on the last link I shared, and then it will kind of share. It will send you directly to the quiz game.
In our group now, under biosecurity group.
No, on the Zoom call, on this Zoom call.
On the Zoom
Chat
call,
on the Zoom call.
someone can copy it and paste it on your WhatsApp groups.
Because
So
I'm there now.
Can someone send it on the WhatsApp group that Eunice is a member of? The last link that I shared.
I've done that. I've done that.
So we have 98 participants and 80 have joined. So I'm presuming the 18 people are Bioshield team members because they are not allowed to participate in this. So we are going to start. The rest can join and find us along the way. So we're just going to start, and for this case, I'm going to, you will have 30 seconds. You're not going to have the full 45 minutes because these are things that should be now on your fingertips, right? Because we've gone through some of these things, mentioned them by passing and stuff like that, so they should be on your fingertips. So the moment 30 seconds lapses and these remaining 15 seconds, I'll just end the session. So you need to be very, very quick. Okay, so we're going to start. Oh, what is happening? I don't know what you're seeing on your end. I hope all of you can see all the questions and you're answering all the questions.
I'm not sure they
and
can respond now.
Basit.
I'm not sure they can respond now because of they may be on another screen. But I think I can see that it's moving up, and I think it seems they are answering the questions. Hello, Dr. Ruth. Hello, Dr. Ruth. Hello, Dr. Ruth. I think they are answering the questions.
So we've gone through all the questions. I didn't give you a time, but at this point, most of you had answered the questions correctly. So we are going to review the questions and see why we did wrong, and yeah. So a farmer mixes new chicks with older birds. Which is the most important risk? There was a 94% accuracy, and most of you knew the answer, which is pathogen can spread quickly from older to younger ones. There is people who mentioned pathogens can spread from younger to older. Younger animals, as we mentioned in the class, have low immunity, and it's very likely that the ones who are going to suffer if we mix birds. So we already know that. So we are going to go to the second question, which is most of you got it correctly. And the answer is providing a disinfectant foot bath, not just a foot bath with a disinfectant, which gives the best protection. So if a farmer has, the problem is visitors entering poultry houses. So the best encouragement you can provide is providing a disinfectant foot bath. The next question is, ducks roam freely near chickens. What is the key biosecurity concern? It's ducks can contaminate feed and water with pathogens. The other answers are correct, but the most correct one, yes, ducks make it harder to control diseases to spread on farm, which is correct. Ducks mix with chicken and break isolation between flocks, which could be correct, but it depends. They're roaming freely, but it's just the issue of contamination. They can be roaming freely, but maybe they are not sick, but it's very likely they may contaminate feed and water. The next question was, the answer was separating sick birds with a simple box. A farmer can only afford one change this season. Which one offers the greatest disease prevention? If they have sick birds, if they separate them, the chances are that sick bird may not make all the other birds sick. So cleaning and refilling drinkers only can help, but if they're only able to do one problem, just that's the only thing they're able to do, and they have a disease problem within their farm. If they separate all the sick from the healthy ones, that is going to help them overcome some of the problems they have. The next question was the first upgrade in most realistic and effective of all these upgrades. If a farmer has to do this, a farmer could put a fence. That is possible, but is it realistic and effective? You put a fence, but you've not controlled the free roaming birds and stuff like that. They can put in a hand washing station at the door, but is it very realistic? We know most pathogens spread from stepping on them. Providing farm-only booths at the entrance, yes, it's very possible, but is it very realistic for smallholder farmers? It's very expensive. They can't really afford to provide only booths at the entrance. So the one that is very easy to adopt is ensuring that they have a basin with disinfectant as a foot bath. The next one is why is consistency more powerful than perfection in biosecurity? Because small daily actions block many risks. So that is the correct answer. So because reporting one measure well is easier than complicated one, that is true. But what we are really aiming here at is small daily actions block many risks. So if you tell a farmer, like, the action that I want you to do consistently is, let's say, have a foot bath, it is likely to prevent so many risks, disease entry risks, among other risks that may occur in a farm. So this is something that we need, that is very, very key. Yes, it's easier than doing complicated ones, but consistency is key because we are trying to prevent many risks. The last question is, I think last or second last. When we think about biosecurity in the poultry sector, one of the most important disease entry risks is humans. So all these other things can actually cause disease risks in farms, but humans are the main ones. We move around, we visit each other, we are very social, we do all these things, but we are the ones who are handling these animals. So we are the main disease risk in a poultry production enterprise, and we should act around that. So we already know who won. The person who won, they can we can all clap for them. And we are going to end today's sessions at that, unless there's questions. Yes, Lincoln Kimani.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ruth. So I think it's undeniably a value-packed session today, and I'm sure a very good way to end the weekend. I think we're moving on to the question and answer session, and we don't have so much time on our side. So I can see that Lincoln already signified he has a question to ask. So we're taking a few questions. Lincoln, please go ahead. And if any other person has a question, you can signify with your hands raised up. So I'll call on you.
The host can unmute Lincoln because he's still muted. And we are going to just take 2 pressing questions because it's quite late. And for those who don't really have questions that they don't see the need to stay, they can start leaving. Also, please provide the link to join the WhatsApp group here, or send it on email to the participants so that they can join the WhatsApp group.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Lincoln.
Okay, so my name is Lincoln. So I have a question regarding to question number
Hello?
1.
Yes.
I'm saying I have a to question number 1.
Yes.
If what if the, for example, the flock of chicks had let's say contamination, the disease occurrence and the prevalence was high, so disease spread maybe moved from the chicks to the old flock. So I'm wondering if there's a, okay, I'm asking just about that.
Yeah, yes, it's very possible that the pathogens may spread from younger birds to older birds. That is very possible. But the precedent or the context that we are aiming here at, a farmer is getting chicks that are likely not sick. If they have gotten them from a hatchery and they've gotten them from a proper hatchery, these chicks come in not sick. So the risk is higher because the older birds have stronger immunity, among other things, that may make it easy for the young ones to actually get sick as opposed to the older ones.
Okay, it's okay. It's not that I'm going against the question. It's the question. It's just the question wasn't specified on the health status of the chicks. Now you see, maybe for example, someone maybe assumed the flock of chicks maybe you got from a local farmer, from maybe from your friend. So you see the occurrence of the disease can be high.
It's very likely. It's very likely. But in the context of the questions are here, yeah. Okay. There is one other question that was there, and then we. No problem, Alilcon. There was another question. Was it Damilola, sorry. Please proceed, Damilola.
Please proceed, Damilola. You can go ahead.
Hello.
Hello, Damilola.
Okay, good evening, ma. Sorry, my network is quite poor. That's why I was logged out. So, one thing I've observed, because I'm really interested in this, is all these strategies, the separation, the clean entry, and all, they are somewhat interwoven. So I don't know if really there is a point of clear distinction between them, showing their importance. Because if I isolate the bird and I'm not maintaining clean entry, people can still introduce disease into the farm. And if I disinfect the farm, and let's assume I didn't separate this bird, so there was one incubating a disease without observing quarantine, it's still introducing disease despite that I'm disinfecting my food and all of that. So I don't know if there's really a clear distinction between these points, ma. I'm quite.
Yes, thank you, Damilola, for bringing that up. Yes, there isn't all these things are interconnected, as you've mentioned, like clean separation, clean entry, and feed. They are all interconnected. They all help in kind of ensuring animals don't get sick and they are healthy, among other things. But when we are thinking about biosecurity and when we are dealing with smallholder farmer, the reason as to why I separated the two, so that it's easier when you are speaking to a farmer, you know this is a clean issue, this is a separation issue, this is a feed issue when you're speaking about the farmer. But if the birds are not properly fed, even if you separate and you've cleaned, these birds may not add weight optimally. Or as you mentioned the example, if you've cleaned and you are not separating the sick, among other things. So they're very, very interconnected. The point we are trying to raise here as with the separation, it was essentially like when you meet a farmer, you need to think about all these issues in the context of which one can easily be done in the context of this is a cleaning issue. Let me just tackle it as a cleaning. Let me tell this farmer to clean and stuff like that without being rude. Or this is a separation issue. Let me target that and do that. So this is how it works. So ensuring that The separation, cleanness, all of them are very interconnected, but when you're dealing with a farmer, you need to see how you package that information as one issue, because you may say like separation, and the example I even gave in the slide was clean versus dirty. It's a same. It's a method of separation. You're separating the clean area and the dirty area. By putting a footbath, you're separating the clean area and the dirty area. So they're all interconnected. So it's just how you approach them, and the separation is just for purposes of learning. Felix Muonge, and this will be the last question. And if there is any other question, you can pass them through the Bioshield team, and then we can tackle them from there.
Please, you can go ahead. Alunge, is that correct? No, Felix, sorry, Felix, you can go ahead. Felix, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much. My question is about what that quick brainstorming quiz that we have gone through. I would need some clarification, because when you look at some poultry farms, in most cases, it is very easy to restrict humans to access them, but it is very hard to restrict wild animals and rodents, wild birds and rodents to access them. So my question to Madam or Miss Ruth is couldn't the wild birds and rodents outnumber outshine the humans in the potency or in the risk of spreading disease on the poultry farm? Then also another thing, this I think goes to the team, the assignment of visiting the farms and taking the pics and organizing all that. Initially, the email that was sent was saying that within a week's time, but then I saw, as Madam Ruth was presenting, that we are given a gestation period of 48 hours. Thank you.
Okay, so the question on the time period, the Bioshield team is going to address that. So I'm going back to the rodents and the vermins. So in this context, if a farmer is keeping poultry, most of the time, they don't want rodents. They don't want wild birds. Wild birds eat feed. Wild birds do all these things. So most farm and some wild birds or wild animals kill the birds. So most farms, especially serious smallholder, broiler, and layer production systems, which we are tackling here, they tend to have all these factors taken into consideration. There may be small holes in the poultry house, but it's not a major issue. In terms of like one small bird may go into the poultry house, but you don't find like 100 rats in a poultry house. The farmer won't be happy, or 100 small birds, or all these things. So the notion that small birds will, or wild birds and rodents will overtake humans in the context of disease spread is fundamentally lower. It's still a risk, but it's fundamentally lower than a human being. A human being wakes up in the morning, goes to the market, and they have access to the door. They open, go in, provide water, walk out, go to the geese, do something, walk back to the poultry house. So the human beings are interacting with the birds more, unlike how rodents will interact with the birds. So essentially, the answer is human beings will always be the biggest risk factor in poultry production enterprises based on the interaction they have with these animals. So I'm going to presume there is no other question, and I'm going to kindly request that I leave the call. It was nice talking to you all, and I hope you've learned a couple of things. These slides have been already shared to the team, and they will be shared with you, and you may have a chance to read through them. There's some reading materials that are there within the slides. If you like, you may read them as well. So bye-bye and enjoy the training session, and I hope some of you will be able to go to the field practices part of the sessions. Okay, bye-bye all.